Imagine, if you will, the golden light of dawn filtering through the ornate columns of a palace workshop in ancient Memphis, somewhere around 1450 BCE. The scent of cedar wood shavings mingles with frankincense as skilled artisans bend over a limestone steel, their bronze chisels tapping with rhythmic precision. They're carving something extraordinary, something that will survive 3.5 millennia to puzzle archaeologists in our modern age. The hieroglyphs taking shape under their tools spell out a name that would later echo through history, though in a form most would never recognize. Mose. Not Moses, the Hebrew liberator of Sunday school stories, but Mose, a title, a rank, a whispered acknowledgement of power that reaches far beyond what traditional narratives would have us believe. This is the Mose stele, discovered in the ruins of ancient Memphis, likely commissioned during the reign of Ramesses II. But here's where our gentle investigation becomes particularly intriguing. This stone monument appears to commemorate not a Hebrew prophet, but an Egyptian prince general, a military commander whose achievements were significant enough to merit permanent stone memory in one of Egypt's most important cities. Picture this young man, perhaps in his 20s, standing before the great pharaoh. His skin bears the sun-kissed bronze of someone who has spent countless hours training under the desert sun. His eyes hold that peculiar mixture of confidence and calculation that marks those born to command. He wears the traditional linen kilt of Egyptian nobility, his chest adorned with the gold collar that signifies royal favor. To all appearances, he is thoroughly, completely Egyptian. Yet something whispers beneath the surface, something that would, decades later, transform this celebrated prince into history's most enigmatic liberator. The Egypt of this era wasn't the crumbling kingdom of Hollywood imagination. This was the Egypt of the New Kingdom's golden age, a civilization at the absolute pinnacle of its power and sophistication. The pharaohs commanded territories stretching from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates in the north. Egyptian culture had reached such heights of refinement that neighboring kingdoms sent their princes to be educated in Egyptian schools, much as European nobility would later send their children to study in Paris. In this context, imagine the young Mose rising through the ranks of Egyptian society with meteoric speed. The ancient world operated on patronage and proven ability, and this young man seemed to possess both in abundance. Military campaigns along the contested borders with the Hittites, administrative oversight of construction projects that would rival any wonder of the ancient world, perhaps even diplomatic missions to the courts of foreign kings. All of this formed the backdrop of a career that seemed destined for the highest honors Egypt could bestow. But there's something else captured in those carefully carved hieroglyphs, something that speaks to a mystery that has puzzled historians for generations. The Egyptian records of this period, usually meticulous in their documentation of royal activities and achievements, contain curious gaps. Persons of significant importance sometimes simply disappear from the official narratives. One day they're receiving honors from the pharaoh, their names inscribed in temple walls and victory monuments. The next, it's as if they never existed. This phenomenon becomes particularly intriguing when we consider the political dynamics of ancient Egypt. The pharaoh, while revered as divine, governed through a complex web of relationships with priests, generals, regional governors, and foreign diplomats. Anyone achieving significant prominence in such a system would, by necessity, accumulate both devoted allies and dangerous enemies. Power in ancient Egypt was never simply given. It was carefully balanced, constantly negotiated, perpetually at risk. Now, let's drift our attention to a seemingly unrelated matter: the mysterious presence of Semitic peoples in ancient Egypt. This wasn't unusual. Egypt's wealth and stability had long attracted immigrants from the Levant, refugees from famine, merchants seeking opportunity, and yes, occasionally, entire populations fleeing disasters in their homelands. Egyptian art and records show us Semitic people serving in various capacities throughout Egyptian society. As skilled craftsmen, as merchants, as soldiers, and sometimes as slaves. But here's where the historical record becomes fascinatingly complex. The Semitic population of Egypt wasn't uniformly oppressed. Some rose to positions of considerable influence. Joseph's story, whether understood as literal history or cultural memory, reflects a pattern that was actually quite common. Talented foreigners, particularly those with administrative or diplomatic skills, often found themselves elevated to positions of significant responsibility within the Egyptian hierarchy. This brings us to a question that has intrigued scholars for centuries. What if the man who would become Moses began his adult life not as a Hebrew exile, but as a fully integrated member of Egyptian elite society? What if his connection to the Hebrew population of Egypt was something he discovered, rather than something he was born into? Consider the psychological complexity of such a scenario. Imagine growing up believing yourself to be Egyptian nobility, only to discover that your true heritage lies with a population that exists on the margins of Egyptian society. The identity crisis alone would be profound. But now add to this the political implications. If this revelation occurred after he had already achieved significant prominence within Egyptian society, the ramifications would extend far beyond personal identity. In the ancient world, bloodline determined not just social position, but legal rights, religious obligations, and political allegiances. A man who discovered that his true heritage lay not with Egyptian nobility, but with a Semitic slave population would face an impossible choice: maintain his position through deception, or acknowledge his true identity and lose everything he had achieved. But perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that such a man might attempt to forge a third path, one that honored both his adopted Egyptian sophistication and his discovered Hebrew heritage. Such an attempt would require extraordinary political skill, tremendous personal courage, and most importantly, a plan so audacious that it would seem impossible to everyone except the man attempting it. The Egypt of the mid-15th century BCE was a civilization of incredible complexity and sophistication. But it was also a civilization built on very specific religious and social foundations. The pharaoh's divine authority rested on the belief that he was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the earthly representative of the entire Egyptian pantheon. Egyptian society was organized around this central religious principle, with complex hierarchies of priests, nobles, and administrators all serving to maintain the divine order that kept Egyptian civilization functioning. Into this carefully balanced system, imagine the introduction of a different religious vision, not the violent overthrow of Egyptian religion, but a subtle challenge to its fundamental assumptions. What if there was a divine power that operated according to different principles? What if the pharaoh's authority, while certainly impressive, was not actually ultimate? Such ideas, carefully introduced by someone with both the political skill to navigate Egyptian court intrigue and the religious vision to articulate a compelling alternative, could potentially reshape not just personal loyalties, but the fundamental structure of Egyptian society itself. This is where our story begins to move from historical speculation into the realm of political thriller. Because if a prominent Egyptian noble began quietly questioning fundamental assumptions about divine authority and social organization, he would very quickly find himself at the center of forces much larger than personal identity or religious conviction. The priest bureaucrats who managed Egypt's vast temple complexes derived their power and wealth from the existing religious system. Regional governors maintained their authority through their relationships with pharaonic power. Military commanders, merchants, and foreign diplomats all operated within a carefully constructed framework of expectations and obligations that had maintained Egyptian stability for centuries. Anyone proposing significant changes to this system would face opposition from multiple directions simultaneously. But someone with the political skill to navigate these challenges, the religious vision to offer compelling alternatives, and most importantly, the personal charisma to inspire others to follow him into uncertainty. Such a person might actually succeed in ways that would seem impossible to contemporary observers. And here's where the story becomes particularly intriguing for our modern sensibilities. What if the miracles associated with Moses were actually the result of sophisticated political planning rather than supernatural intervention? What if the famous plagues represented not divine wrath, but carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to undermine Egyptian authority and create conditions favorable to a mass migration? Consider the political genius of such an approach. Rather than attempting to overthrow the Egyptian government through military force, which would have been doomed to failure, why not create conditions that would make the pharaoh himself desperate to see the Hebrew population leave Egypt voluntarily? Think about it. If you wanted to convince a powerful ruler to release a valuable labor force, you would need to create situations where keeping them became more costly than losing them. You would need to demonstrate that their continued presence posed risks to Egyptian stability that outweighed their economic value. From this perspective, the famous plagues begin to look less like random disasters and more like a carefully planned psychological warfare campaign. Each plague targeted specific aspects of Egyptian religion and economy in ways calculated to maximize political pressure on the pharaoh while minimizing actual harm to the Hebrew population. The transformation of the Nile to blood, for instance, struck at the heart of Egyptian religious identity. The Nile was not just Egypt's economic lifeline, but a manifestation of divine order itself. An event that made the Nile appear corrupted would have profound psychological impact on every level of Egyptian society, from the pharaoh himself down to the farmers who depended on the river's annual flood. But here's what's particularly intriguing. Such an effect might actually be achievable through entirely natural means. The Nile periodically experiences red algae blooms that can make the water appear blood-colored and temporarily undrinkable. If someone with detailed knowledge of Egyptian environmental patterns could predict when such phenomena might occur, they could time their political demands to coincide with these natural events in ways that would seem miraculous to contemporary observers. Similarly, the plague of frogs might reflect nothing more supernatural than a knowledgeable observer's ability to predict the environmental consequences of algae blooms. When river ecosystems are disrupted, amphibian populations often respond in dramatic and visible ways. Each successive plague appears to build on the environmental and psychological impact of its predecessors, creating a cascade of social pressure that would make the pharaoh increasingly desperate to resolve the crisis. From the perspective of Egyptian court officials, the correlation between Hebrew demands and environmental disasters would seem impossible to explain through conventional means. But from the perspective of someone with both sophisticated environmental knowledge and deep understanding of Egyptian psychology, such a campaign might represent nothing more than excellent planning and fortunate timing. And this brings us to perhaps the most psychologically compelling aspect of the entire story. What if Moses himself wasn't entirely certain whether he was implementing a carefully planned political strategy or serving as an instrument of divine will? What if the distinction between sophisticated human planning and miraculous intervention was something that became clear only in retrospect. Imagine the internal experience of someone navigating such an enormously complex and dangerous undertaking. The coordination required to time environmental events with political demands, to maintain Hebrew morale while increasing Egyptian pressure, to negotiate with Egyptian officials while preparing for a mass migration. All of this would require skills and knowledge that would seem almost superhuman to contemporary observers. Yet such skills were not impossible. The ancient world produced individuals of extraordinary capability, people who combined political sophistication, scientific knowledge, military expertise, and personal charisma in ways that allowed them to reshape the societies around them. Alexander the Great managed to conquer most of the known world before his 30th birthday. Julius Caesar transformed the Roman Republic into an empire that would endure for centuries. Akhenaten briefly convinced the entire Egyptian establishment to abandon millennia of religious tradition in favor of his revolutionary monotheism. Moses' achievement, while certainly remarkable, was not necessarily more extraordinary than other documented historical accomplishments. What makes his story unique is not its impossibility, but its combination of political sophistication with religious vision in service of what appears to be history's first successful campaign for national liberation. As we drift towards sleep, let this image settle gently in your mind. A young man, perhaps in his 30s now, standing on a balcony overlooking the Nile in the pre-dawn darkness. The great river flows silently below, carrying the hopes and fears of one of history's greatest civilizations toward an uncertain future. Behind him, the palace sleeps, unaware that within its walls someone is planning what would become one of history's most extraordinary gambles. He wears simple linen now, having put aside the gold collar and ceremonial weapons that once marked his status within Egyptian society. His face bears the lines that come from making decisions that will affect not just himself, but potentially hundreds of thousands of people whose fate has somehow become his responsibility. In a few hours, he will once again enter the throne room and make demands that seem impossible. He will speak words that will echo through millennia, setting in motion events that will reshape not just Egypt, but the entire ancient Near East. And he will do so knowing that failure means not just personal destruction, but the continued suffering of all those who have placed their faith in his vision of liberation. But for now, in these quiet moments before dawn, he is simply a man contemplating the enormous weight of responsibility that circumstances have placed upon his shoulders. The Nile flows on, carrying its ancient burden of silt and dreams toward the delta, indifferent to human ambition, yet somehow central to everything that is about to unfold. As consciousness gently returns to our story, let us drift backward in time to witness something extraordinary. The quiet transformation of a man's understanding of power itself. Picture, if you will, Moses in the months following his exile from Egyptian court. Not the dramatic, Hollywood-style banishment, but something far more nuanced and psychologically complex. Imagine him in the land of Midian, tending sheep in the vast wilderness that stretches between civilizations. The work is simple, repetitive, contemplative. Day after day, he guides woolly creatures across terrain that changes slowly with the seasons, learning the subtle patterns of wind and weather that determine where water might be found, where pasture might sustain a flock, where dangers might lurk behind seemingly peaceful ridges. For someone who had spent years navigating the intricate political machinery of Egyptian civilization, this simplicity might have felt initially like exile from everything meaningful. But consider what such solitude might offer to a mind trained in both Egyptian sophistication and Hebrew spiritual traditions. The opportunity to think systematically about power, authority, and social organization without the constant pressure of court intrigue and political necessity. In the silence of the wilderness, profound questions could finally receive the attention they deserved. What made pharaonic authority actually effective? Was it the religious mythology that portrayed the pharaoh as divine? The economic systems that channeled Egypt's wealth through royal control? The military might that enforced royal decisions? The bureaucratic structures that translated royal wishes into practical reality? Or was there something more fundamental? Something that existed in the space between ruler and ruled? Something that could be understood, analyzed, and potentially redirected? These are not the questions of a simple shepherd. These are the questions of someone with intimate knowledge of how power actually operates, combined with the intellectual freedom to examine those mechanisms without immediate political pressure. This is strategic thinking at the highest level, conducted in circumstances that allowed for genuine insight rather than mere tactical calculation. Now, let us drift our attention to what was simultaneously occurring within Egypt itself. The Hebrew population, estimates suggest perhaps 2 million people spread throughout the Nile Delta and beyond, was not a monolithic group awaiting liberation. They were farmers, craftsmen, builders, merchants, soldiers, and yes, some slaves, but their social organization was far more complex than simple oppression narratives suggest. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the Nile Delta reveals Hebrew communities that maintain their own cultural traditions while participating actively in Egyptian economic and social life. They built houses in distinctly Hebrew architectural styles, maintained Hebrew religious practices, and preserved Hebrew tribal identifications. Yet they also participated in Egyptian trade networks, served in Egyptian military units, and in some cases achieved positions of considerable prominence within Egyptian society. This presents a fascinating challenge for anyone contemplating large-scale social change. How do you organize a population that is not uniformly oppressed? How do you create sufficient motivation for mass migration among people who have established lives, economic relationships, and social connections within the existing system? The answer, as Moses appears to have understood, lies not in appeals to abstract principles, but in the careful cultivation of shared identity and common purpose. This requires sophisticated understanding of group psychology, combined with practical knowledge of how to translate psychological motivation into coordinated action. Consider the genius of the approach that begins to emerge from the biblical narrative when read as political strategy rather than simple moral instruction. Rather than attempting to convince individual Hebrews to abandon their established lives in favor of uncertain alternatives, Moses appears to have focused on creating conditions that would make continued residence in Egypt increasingly untenable for the Hebrew population as a whole. This is mass psychology at its most sophisticated level. Individual decisions are notoriously difficult to predict or control, but group behavior often follows patterns that can be understood and influenced by those with sufficient knowledge and skill. A political leader who understood these patterns could potentially create situations where individual decisions would align with broader strategic objectives without requiring explicit coordination. The famous plagues, viewed from this perspective, begin to reveal themselves as masterpieces of psychological warfare. Each plague was designed not simply to pressure the pharaoh, but to create social conditions that would simultaneously demonstrate Hebrew distinctiveness, Egyptian vulnerability, and the necessity of Hebrew departure. Consider the plague of darkness, for instance. Egyptian religion placed enormous importance on Ra, the sun god, whose daily journey across the sky represented the fundamental order of the universe. A period of extended darkness would strike at the very heart of Egyptian religious confidence, creating psychological conditions where even Egyptian officials might begin to question the effectiveness of their traditional spiritual practices. But the biblical narrative specifies that this darkness affected only Egyptian areas. Hebrew districts remained illuminated. From a psychological perspective, this distinction would have profound impact on both populations. Egyptians would experience their religious worldview challenged in the most fundamental way possible, while Hebrews would experience dramatic confirmation that they possessed spiritual resources unavailable to their Egyptian neighbors. Whether this distinction was achieved through supernatural intervention or sophisticated environmental manipulation becomes almost irrelevant from the perspective of political effect. What matters is that both populations would experience events that reinforced the developing narrative of Hebrew distinctiveness and Egyptian vulnerability. But here's where the strategy becomes particularly brilliant. Each plague created not just psychological pressure, but practical economic costs that would make the Hebrew population increasingly burdensome from the Egyptian perspective. Environmental disasters disrupted agricultural production, damaged infrastructure, and required resources for cleanup and repair. A rational Egyptian administrator might reasonably conclude that the continued presence of the Hebrew population was creating costs that exceeded their economic value. Simultaneously, each plague demonstrated to the Hebrew population that continued residence in Egypt involved risks that were increasing rather than diminishing. Even those who had achieved comfortable positions within Egyptian society might reasonably conclude that their long-term security required alternative arrangements. This dual pressure, Egyptian desire to see the Hebrews leave combined with Hebrew recognition that departure might be necessary, created conditions where mass migration became not just politically possible, but economically logical for both parties. Yet executing such a migration would require coordination on a scale that seems almost impossible to contemporary imagination. 2 million people, with their livestock, possessions, and food supplies, moving across terrain that offered limited water sources and no infrastructure for supporting large populations. The logistical challenges alone would require years of careful planning and preparation. Here is where Moses' Egyptian background becomes absolutely crucial. Managing large-scale population movements was precisely the kind of challenge that Egyptian administration excelled at addressing. Egyptian officials routinely coordinated massive construction projects that required moving thousands of workers, along with their tools, materials, and supplies, across considerable distances and sustaining them for extended periods. The administrative systems developed for pyramid construction, for instance, involved coordinating the activities of quarrymen, transporters, craftsmen, food suppliers, tool makers, and supervisors across multiple locations and time periods. The knowledge required to manage such projects, understanding logistics, personnel management, resource allocation, and contingency planning, was exactly what would be needed to organize a successful mass migration. Someone with intimate knowledge of Egyptian administrative methods would understand not just how to organize large groups of people, but how to do so in ways that minimized conflict, maximized efficiency, and provided for the inevitable complications that arise when theoretical plans encounter practical reality. But even more importantly, such a person would understand Egyptian military capabilities and limitations. Successfully leading 2 million people out of Egypt would require not just organizational skill, but detailed knowledge of Egyptian military deployment, response times, strategic priorities, and resource constraints. Egyptian military power, while certainly formidable, was designed primarily for managing external threats and maintaining internal order within established population centers. The The prospect of pursuing a rapidly moving population across desert terrain that offered few strategic advantages would present challenges that Egyptian commanders might reasonably choose to avoid, particularly if the departure occurred during periods when Egyptian military resources were committed elsewhere. The timing of the exodus becomes crucial from this perspective. Egyptian records suggest that the mid-15th century BCE was a period of extensive military activity along Egypt's northern and eastern borders. Egyptian forces were engaged in campaigns against the Hittites, managing rebellions in Syrian territories, and dealing with various diplomatic crises that required significant military resources. A mass Hebrew departure during such a period would present Egyptian decision-makers with difficult choices. Commit additional military resources to retrieving a population that had already demonstrated its ability to create significant costs, or accept the departure and focus available resources on more strategically important challenges. For someone with detailed knowledge of Egyptian strategic priorities and resource constraints, the calculation might be relatively straightforward. Create conditions where the cost of retrieval exceeds the value of the population being retrieved, and rational Egyptian decision-makers will choose to let the departure proceed. This is strategic thinking at the highest level, the kind of comprehensive analysis that considers not just immediate tactical challenges, but the broader political and economic forces that shape decision-making at the highest levels of government. It requires deep understanding of how institutions actually function, combined with the intellectual sophistication to predict how complex systems will respond to carefully introduced pressures. But perhaps most remarkably, it requires the personal courage to stake everything, including the lives of 2 million people, on the accuracy of one's analysis and the effectiveness of one's planning. Consider the psychological complexity of someone attempting such an undertaking. Every decision carries enormous consequences. Miscalculate Egyptian military response times, and entire Hebrew communities could be slaughtered. Misjudge the logistics of desert travel, and thousands could die of thirst or starvation. Fail to maintain Hebrew morale during the inevitable difficulties of migration, and the entire effort could collapse into chaos. Yet proceed he did, with a confidence that suggests either extraordinary faith or extraordinary knowledge, or perhaps some combination of both that transcends our modern distinctions between religious vision and political expertise. The biblical narrative preserves fascinating glimpses of the organizational complexity that such an undertaking required. References to tribal leaders, administrative systems, judicial processes, and resource management suggest a level of social organization that goes far beyond simple flight from oppression. This was a carefully planned relocation of an entire society, complete with systems for maintaining order, resolving disputes, and ensuring that basic needs were met during an extended period of transition. Archaeological evidence from the Sinai Peninsula reveals scattered traces of large-scale ancient settlements that might reflect way stations or encampments used during such a migration. While definitive identification remains elusive, the logistics of moving 2 million people across desert terrain would certainly require planned stopping points with adequate water sources and temporary infrastructure for food preparation and waste management. From our perspective, drifting gently between sleep and waking, these logistical details might seem mundane compared to the drama of miraculous plagues and divine intervention. But consider the profound humanity revealed in such careful attention to practical necessities. Someone planning this migration devoted enormous attention to ensuring that children would have adequate food, that elderly people would not be left behind, that pregnant women would receive appropriate care, that tools and possessions essential for future settlement could be safely transported. This is not the work of a religious fanatic or a political demagogue. This is the work of someone who understood that successful liberation requires not just dramatic gestures, but patient attention to the countless small details that determine whether grand visions translate into livable realities. As we prepare to drift deeper into our exploration of this remarkable story, let this image settle gently in your consciousness. A group of Hebrew leaders gathered around a simple oil lamp in the pre-dawn darkness, reviewing lists written on papyrus scrolls. The lists contain names, family groups, resource allocations, route options, contingency plans. Outside, 2 million people sleep, most unaware of the extraordinary complexity of planning that has been conducted on their behalf. In a few hours, history will begin to unfold in ways that will echo through millennia. The careful preparations that have consumed months or perhaps years of secretive effort will finally be tested against the unpredictable realities of human ambition, natural challenges, and divine intervention. But for now, in these quiet moments before dawn, there is only the gentle scratching of reed pens on papyrus, the soft murmur of voices discussing options and alternatives, and the profound weight of responsibility that comes with attempting to reshape the world. Let us now drift into the heart of one of history's most extraordinary nights. A night when careful planning met unprecedented crisis, when human preparation encountered forces beyond anyone's complete control, when the fate of 2 million people hung in the balance of decisions made in darkness and uncertainty. Picture the Hebrew districts of the Nile Delta on this particular evening. To casual observers, the day had proceeded much like any other. Hebrew families had attended to their usual occupations, tending livestock, working in craft workshops, managing small farms, participating in the complex economic networks that sustained Egyptian civilization. Children had played in dusty streets. Merchants had negotiated prices in bustling marketplaces. Elders had gathered in familiar groups to discuss community concerns and share traditional stories. But beneath this surface normalcy, something extraordinary was taking shape. In houses throughout the Hebrew settlements, families were quietly making final preparations for a journey that would transform not just their own lives, but the course of human history. The preparations had been coordinated with care that bordered on the miraculous, or perhaps reflected planning so sophisticated that it seemed miraculous to those who didn't understand its complexity. Consider the psychological challenge alone. Maintaining normal appearances while preparing for mass departure requires not just individual self-control, but community-wide discipline of almost unimaginable proportions. 2 million people, including children, elderly individuals, and those with no particular reason to trust Moses' leadership, somehow managed to prepare for departure while avoiding the kind of obvious changes in behavior that would alert Egyptian authorities to what was occurring. This suggests organizational capacity that goes far beyond simple religious enthusiasm or desperate hope. This suggests systems of communication, coordination, and mutual support that had been developed over months or perhaps years of careful preparation. It suggests leadership structures that could maintain discipline and morale even under circumstances of extraordinary stress and uncertainty. The biblical narrative preserves remarkable details about the events of this night, details that become even more intriguing when examined from the perspective of someone attempting to coordinate such a massive undertaking. The instructions are precise, comprehensive, and designed to address exactly the kind of practical challenges that would arise during large-scale emergency evacuation. Each Hebrew family was to prepare a specific meal, following exact specifications that would ensure adequate nutrition for extended travel, while using ingredients that could be prepared quickly and consumed without elaborate cooking facilities. The meal was to be eaten while dressed for travel, with essential possessions packed and ready for immediate departure. From a modern perspective, these instructions sound like emergency evacuation protocols designed by someone with detailed understanding of both nutritional requirements and logistical constraints. The specified meal provided balanced nutrition that would sustain people during the initial stages of a difficult journey, while the preparation methods ensured that no family would be delayed by complex cooking procedures when the departure signal was given. But the most psychologically significant aspect of these preparations was their symbolic dimension. The meal itself became a ritual of transformation, a shared experience that unified 2 million individuals into a single people with a common destiny. By following identical procedures, eating identical food, and maintaining identical states of readiness, the Hebrew population was transformed from a collection of families and communities into something approaching a unified nation. This is mass psychology deployed with extraordinary sophistication. Rather than attempting to coordinate 2 million individual decisions through complex communication networks, Moses created a shared ritual experience that allowed everyone to participate in the same psychological transformation simultaneously. The practical preparation for departure became inseparable from the spiritual preparation for a new kind of collective identity. Meanwhile, throughout Egyptian society, the final plague was beginning to unfold. The death of the firstborn, the event that would finally convince the pharaoh to release the Hebrew population voluntarily rather than face continued catastrophe. Here we encounter one of the most challenging aspects of the entire narrative. From a contemporary perspective, the deliberate targeting of innocent children seems inconsistent with any conception of divine justice or political morality. Yet from the perspective of ancient Near Eastern political dynamics, such targeting represented precisely the kind of pressure that would be most effective in forcing immediate political change. In societies where political authority passed through hereditary succession, threats to potential heirs represented threats to the continuity of political systems themselves. A pharaoh might accept economic damage, military setbacks, or even threats to his own life rather than compromise his political authority. But threats to the succession itself would force reconsideration of any political calculation. Whether this plague represented supernatural intervention, carefully planned assassination, or some combination of both, its political effect would be identical, creating circumstances where continued resistance to Hebrew demands became impossible for any rational political leader. But consider the psychological impact on the Hebrew population itself. Throughout the months of mounting plagues, they had watched Egyptian authority gradually erode while their own community remained mysteriously protected. Now, in this final crisis, they experienced not just protection, but clear demonstration that their destiny was fundamentally different from that of their Egyptian neighbors. The psychological transformation would be profound and permanent. A population that had lived for centuries as minorities within Egyptian society suddenly experienced themselves as the chosen survivors of a catastrophe that had devastated their former masters. The implications for group identity, collective confidence, and willingness to undertake extraordinary challenges would be difficult to overestimate. Yet the most remarkable aspect of this night was not the crisis itself, but the response it generated. As news of the plague spread throughout Egyptian society, creating panic and desperate demands that the Hebrew population be released immediately, the Hebrew communities maintained discipline and organization that enabled them to transform crisis into opportunity. Within hours, 2 million people were mobilized for departure. Not just individuals, but families with children, elderly relatives, livestock, tools, clothing, food supplies, and all the accumulated possessions that represented lifetimes of work and saving. The logistical complexity of such mobilization strains contemporary imagination. Yet the biblical narrative suggests it was accomplished with efficiency that seemed almost supernatural to observers. This efficiency reflected not miraculous intervention alone, but months of careful preparation combined with leadership structures that could function effectively under extreme pressure. Every family knew exactly what to pack, exactly where to gather, exactly who to follow, and exactly what role to play in the larger migration. Such coordination is impossible without extensive prior planning and sophisticated communication networks. But perhaps the most psychologically compelling aspect of this night was the transformation it represented for Moses himself. For months, he had operated as a strategic planner, coordinating complex political and logistical challenges through careful analysis and systematic preparation. Now, suddenly, he found himself responsible for the immediate safety and survival of 2 million people whose fate depended entirely on decisions he would make in the next few hours. Consider the weight of such responsibility. Every choice, which route to take, how fast to travel, where to stop for rest, how to respond to inevitable Egyptian pursuit, would determine whether this extraordinary gamble succeeded or collapsed into catastrophe. The months of preparation had brought him to this moment, but preparation could only go so far. Everything now depended on his ability to make correct decisions under circumstances no amount of planning could completely anticipate. The biblical narrative captures something of this psychological complexity in its portrayal of Moses during the departure itself. He appears simultaneously confident and uncertain, decisive and dependent on guidance that transcends merely human calculation. This tension reflects not contradiction, but the authentic experience of someone operating at the absolute limits of human capability while attempting something that seemed impossible to everyone, including himself. As the Great Migration began to move through the darkness, imagine the extraordinary sight it must have presented. 2 million people, traveling in organized tribal groups, their possessions loaded on carts and carried by pack animals, moving across the landscape in a procession that stretched for miles. The practical challenges alone, maintaining order, preventing separation, ensuring that elderly and sick individuals weren't left behind, would require continuous coordination and adjustment. Yet this was occurring during a night of unprecedented crisis throughout Egyptian society. Egyptian families were dealing with their own catastrophic losses. Egyptian officials were struggling to maintain order in communities devastated by the final plague, and Egyptian military commanders were trying to assess threats and coordinate responses while lacking clear information about what was actually happening. From the perspective of Egyptian authority, the Hebrew departure might initially have seemed like a solution rather than a problem. If the presence of the Hebrew population was somehow connected to the catastrophes that had been devastating Egyptian society, their voluntary departure might offer hope that normal conditions could be restored. But as dawn approached and the full scope of the Hebrew departure became clear, Egyptian calculations began to change. 2 million people represented not just labor, but enormous economic value. Their departure meant the loss of skilled craftsmen, experienced farmers, trained soldiers, and established merchants whose economic activities contributed significantly to Egyptian prosperity. Moreover, the manner of their departure, organized, coordinated, and obviously planned in advance, suggested that this was not desperate flight, but calculated political action. The Hebrew population hadn't simply fled in panic. They had executed a sophisticated strategy that had outmaneuvered Egyptian authority at every step. For Egyptian pride and political credibility, such a development was almost intolerable. A pharaoh who allowed 2 million subjects to simply walk away after months of systematically defying royal authority would appear weak to neighboring kingdoms, vulnerable to his own nobles, and ineffective in managing the divine responsibilities that justified his rule. But consider the psychological impact on the Hebrew population itself. Throughout the months of mounting plagues, they had watched Egyptian authority gradually erode while their own community remained mysteriously protected. Now, in this final crisis, they experienced not just protection, but clear demonstration that their destiny was fundamentally different from that of their Egyptian neighbors. The psychological transformation would be profound and permanent. A population that had lived for centuries as minorities within Egyptian society suddenly experienced themselves as the chosen survivors of a catastrophe that had devastated their former masters. The implications for group identity, collective confidence, and willingness to undertake extraordinary challenges would be difficult to overestimate. Yet the most remarkable aspect of this night was not the crisis itself, but the response it generated. As news of the plague spread throughout Egyptian society, creating panic and desperate demands that the Hebrew population be released immediately, the Hebrew communities maintained discipline and organization that enabled them to transform crisis into opportunity. Within hours, 2 million people were mobilized for departure. Not just individuals, but families with children, elderly relatives, livestock, tools, clothing, food supplies, and all the accumulated possessions that represented lifetimes of work and saving. The logistical complexity of such mobilization strains contemporary imagination. Yet the biblical narrative suggests it was accomplished with efficiency that seemed almost supernatural to observers. This efficiency reflected not miraculous intervention alone, but months of careful preparation combined with leadership structures that could function effectively under extreme pressure. Every family knew exactly what to pack, exactly where to gather, exactly who to follow, and exactly what role to play in the larger migration. Such coordination is impossible without extensive prior planning and sophisticated communication networks. But perhaps the most psychologically compelling aspect of this night was the transformation it represented for Moses himself. For months, he had operated as a strategic planner, coordinating complex political and logistical challenges through careful analysis and systematic preparation. Now, suddenly, he found himself responsible for the immediate safety and survival of 2 million people whose fate depended entirely on decisions he would make in the next few hours. Consider the weight of such responsibility. Every choice, which route to take, how fast to travel, where to stop for rest, how to respond to inevitable Egyptian pursuit, would determine whether this extraordinary gamble succeeded or collapsed into catastrophe. The months of preparation had brought him to this moment, but preparation could only go so far. Everything now depended on his ability to make correct decisions under circumstances no amount of planning could completely anticipate. The biblical narrative captures something of this psychological complexity in its portrayal of Moses during the departure itself. He appears simultaneously confident and uncertain, decisive and dependent on guidance that transcends merely human calculation. This tension reflects not contradiction, but the authentic experience of someone operating at the absolute limits of human capability while attempting something that seemed impossible to everyone, including himself. As the Great Migration began to move through the darkness, imagine the extraordinary sight it must have presented. 2 million people, traveling in organized tribal groups, their possessions loaded on carts and carried by pack animals, moving across the landscape in a procession that stretched for miles. The practical challenges alone, maintaining order, preventing separation, ensuring that elderly and sick individuals weren't left behind, would require continuous coordination and adjustment. Yet this was occurring during a night of unprecedented crisis throughout Egyptian society. Egyptian families were dealing with their own catastrophic losses. Egyptian officials were struggling to maintain order in communities devastated by the final plague, and Egyptian military commanders were trying to assess threats and coordinate responses while lacking clear information about what was actually happening. From the perspective of Egyptian authority, the Hebrew departure might initially have seemed like a solution rather than a problem. If the presence of the Hebrew population was somehow connected to the catastrophes that had been devastating Egyptian society, their voluntary departure might offer hope that normal conditions could be restored. But as dawn approached and the full scope of the Hebrew departure became clear, Egyptian calculations began to change. 2 million people represented not just labor, but enormous economic value. Their departure meant the loss of skilled craftsmen, experienced farmers, trained soldiers, and established merchants whose economic activities contributed significantly to Egyptian prosperity. Moreover, the manner of their departure, organized, coordinated, and obviously planned in advance, suggested that this was not desperate flight, but calculated political action. The Hebrew population hadn't simply fled in panic. They had executed a sophisticated strategy that had outmaneuvered Egyptian authority at every step. For Egyptian pride and political credibility, such a development was almost intolerable. A pharaoh who allowed 2 million subjects to simply walk away after months of systematically defying royal authority would appear weak to neighboring kingdoms, vulnerable to his own nobles, and ineffective in managing the divine responsibilities that justified his rule. As gentle morning light filters across our continuing story, let us follow the Hebrew people into what would become one of history's most extraordinary experiments in social transformation. 40 years of wandering in the wilderness that would reshape not just their own civilization, but establish principles of law, governance, and spiritual understanding that continue to influence human societies to this day. Picture, if you will, the scene just days after the dramatic crossing of the Red Sea. 2 million people, flush with the excitement of successful liberation, gradually coming to terms with the reality of their situation. Behind them lies the familiar oppression of Egyptian society. Ahead lies nothing that anyone can clearly envision. The wilderness of Sinai stretches in all directions, rocky, austere, offering little obvious sustenance for such enormous numbers of people. There are no cities to provide shelter, no established trade routes to supply necessities, no governmental structures to maintain order, no familiar institutions to guide decision-making or resolve conflicts. For the first time in centuries, the Hebrew people faced the prospect of creating their own civilization from the ground up. This is simultaneously the most liberating and most terrifying challenge imaginable. Freedom from Egyptian control is wonderful in theory, but freedom to starve, to fight among themselves, or to simply dissolve into chaos offers little practical improvement over their previous circumstances. Consider the psychological complexity of this transition. Many of the adults in this migration had been born in Egypt and had never experienced life outside Egyptian institutional structures. They knew how to function as subjects within an established civilization, but they had no experience with the challenges of self-governance, resource management, or conflict resolution that would be required for independent survival. Children and young adults faced even greater challenges. For them, Egyptian civilization represented not just familiarity, but the only model of social organization they had ever observed. How do you create alternative forms of community life when you have no clear vision of what successful alternatives might look like? This is where Moses' Egyptian background becomes crucial in ways that go far beyond military strategy or political maneuvering. Egyptian civilization had developed sophisticated approaches to law, administration, resource management, and social organization that represented centuries of practical experience in managing large populations under challenging circumstances. Someone with intimate knowledge of Egyptian administrative methods would understand not just what worked within Egyptian society, but why it worked. What underlying principles made Egyptian institutions effective in maintaining order, prosperity, and stability across vast territories and diverse populations? But simply replicating Egyptian institutions would not address the fundamental challenge facing the Hebrew people: how to create forms of social organization that reflected their own values, served their own needs, and could function effectively without the enormous material resources that supported Egyptian civilization. The solution that emerges from the biblical narrative represents a remarkable synthesis of Egyptian practical knowledge with Hebrew spiritual vision, creating something entirely new in human history. A society organized around principles of divine law rather than royal authority, designed to function effectively while maintaining commitment to justice, equality, and spiritual development that Egyptian civilization, for all its achievements, had never prioritized. The giving of the law at Mount Sinai, viewed from this perspective, represents not just religious revelation, but the systematic development of a constitutional framework designed to address the specific challenges facing a newly independent people attempting to create sustainable civilization in difficult circumstances. Consider the practical genius of the Ten Commandments, for instance. These aren't simply religious rules, but foundational principles for social organization that address exactly the kinds of problems that would arise among 2 million people attempting to live together without established governmental authority. Prohibitions against theft, murder, and adultery establish basic standards of behavior that make community life possible. Requirements for honoring parents and observing Sabbath rest create structures for maintaining social cohesion and preventing the exploitation of vulnerable populations. The prohibition against coveting addresses the psychological roots of social conflict, while the requirement for exclusive worship of a single deity provides the ideological foundation for unified national identity. From a purely practical perspective, these commandments represent sophisticated social engineering designed by someone who understood both the challenges of managing large populations and the psychological dynamics that determine whether social rules are actually followed or simply ignored. But the legal system that developed during the wilderness period went far beyond these basic principles. The biblical narrative preserves detailed regulations covering everything from property rights and commercial transactions to environmental protection and treatment of foreigners. This represents not random religious legislation, but systematic attention to the practical challenges that any society must address to function effectively. The economic regulations are particularly fascinating from a contemporary perspective. The Hebrew legal system included provisions for debt forgiveness, land redistribution, and care for the poor that were far more sophisticated than anything found in contemporary ancient Near Eastern societies. Similarly, the environmental regulations included in Hebrew law reflect understanding of ecological principles that wouldn't be rediscovered by other civilizations for centuries. Requirements for crop rotation, restrictions on deforestation, and provisions for wildlife protection suggest systematic thinking about the relationship between human communities and natural resources that was remarkably advanced for the ancient world. From the perspective of someone trained in Egyptian administrative methods, such comprehensive legal development would represent exactly the kind of systematic approach that Egyptian institutions used to maintain social order across diverse populations and challenging geographical conditions. The difference was that Hebrew law was designed to serve the people subject to it, rather than to concentrate power in the hands of a ruling elite. But creating legal frameworks is only part of the challenge facing any society. Laws must be implemented, enforced, and adapted to changing circumstances. This requires governmental institutions, judicial systems, and administrative structures that can translate abstract principles into practical reality. The governmental system that developed during the wilderness period reflects remarkable innovation in addressing these challenges. Rather than creating a centralized monarchy like neighboring civilizations, the Hebrew system developed federal structures that balanced tribal autonomy with national coordination, local decision-making with consistent application of basic principles. Moses served as overall leader, but actual governance was distributed among tribal leaders, judicial officials, and specialized administrators who handled different aspects of community life. This distribution of authority prevented the concentration of power that had made Egyptian oppression possible, while ensuring that necessary governmental functions were actually performed. The judicial system that developed during this period was particularly sophisticated. Rather than relying on royal decree or priestly interpretation, Hebrew law established procedures for fact-finding, evidence evaluation, and systematic application of legal principles that were far more advanced than anything found in contemporary societies. Cases were heard by panels of judges rather than individual officials. Evidence requirements were specified in detail, and appeals processes were established to prevent abuse of judicial authority. The system was designed to ensure that legal decisions reflected actual facts and consistent application of law, rather than political convenience or personal preference. From a modern perspective, these innovations might seem obvious, but in the ancient world, they represented revolutionary developments in human governance. Most ancient societies relied on arbitrary royal authority or religious interpretation to resolve disputes and maintain order. The Hebrew system, by contrast, was designed to ensure that law served justice rather than power. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the wilderness period was not the institutional innovations it produced, but the educational process it represented. 40 years of nomadic life served as a comprehensive curriculum in self-governance, resource management, and community cooperation that prepared the Hebrew people for the challenges they would face when they eventually settled in established territories. Consider the practical education that nomadic life provided. Every family had to learn resource conservation, weather prediction, navigation, conflict resolution, and cooperative decision-making. Children grew up understanding that community survival depended on everyone's contribution, and that successful leadership required serving others rather than exploiting them. The daily challenges of nomadic life, finding water, managing livestock, maintaining equipment, dealing with hostile neighbors, provided constant practical education in the skills that would be required for independent civilization. By the time the wilderness period ended, the Hebrew people possessed collective knowledge and experience that equipped them to succeed under circumstances that would have defeated less prepared populations. But the wilderness period also provided something equally important: time for psychological transformation. The generation that had experienced Egyptian oppression gradually died out, replaced by people who had grown up free, who understood themselves as citizens rather than subjects, who possessed confidence in their ability to manage their own affairs rather than depending on the decisions of foreign rulers. This psychological transformation was crucial for long-term success. External liberation is meaningless without internal preparation for the responsibilities that freedom requires. The wilderness period provided the time and experience necessary for such preparation, ensuring that Hebrew independence would be based on genuine capability rather than mere political opportunity. As we drift deeper into this remarkable story, imagine the gradual transformation that occurred over 4 decades of nomadic life. The frightened refugees who fled Egypt gradually became confident citizens capable of creating their own civilization. The chaotic multitude that stood helplessly at the Red Sea gradually developed into organized communities capable of coordinating complex activities across tribal boundaries. Children who had been born in Egyptian slavery grew into adults who understood law, governance, and social cooperation as natural elements of community life, rather than mysterious prerogatives of ruling elites. Young people who had experienced only oppression matured into leaders capable of making decisions that served community welfare rather than personal advantage. The wilderness itself became a teacher, providing daily lessons in resource management, cooperative planning, and mutual support that no classroom could replicate. The harsh environment eliminated artificial distinctions between leaders and followers, rich and poor, forcing everyone to contribute according to their abilities while ensuring that everyone's basic needs were met. By the end of the wilderness period, the Hebrew people had developed something unprecedented in human history, a society organized around principles of justice and equality, equipped with institutions designed to serve human flourishing rather than concentrated power, and populated by people who understood freedom as responsibility rather than license. Moses himself underwent his own transformation during these decades. The strategic planner who had orchestrated the Exodus gradually became something deeper, a teacher, a lawgiver, a model of leadership that served others rather than exploiting them. His Egyptian training provided the foundation, but the wilderness experience refined that training into something entirely new. As we approach the end of this extraordinary period of preparation, let this image settle gently in your consciousness. An elderly Moses standing on a mountain overlooking the promised land, knowing that his own journey is nearly complete, but seeing spread below him the evidence of successful transformation. 2 million people have become a nation. Frightened refugees have become confident citizens. Oppressed slaves have become free people capable of creating justice rather than merely experiencing oppression. The wilderness has completed its curriculum, and graduation day is approaching. The man who began as an Egyptian prince and became a Hebrew liberator is preparing to pass leadership to others who will complete the work he began. But the work itself, the transformation of human possibility, the demonstration that ordinary people can create extraordinary civilizations when guided by principles larger than individual ambition. That work will continue long after his own story ends. Sleep now and dream of transformation so gradual and thorough that it seems like the natural development of human possibility, of education so comprehensive that it reshapes not just knowledge but character, of freedom so carefully prepared that it becomes the foundation for justice rather than chaos. As our gentle journey through this remarkable story draws toward its close, let us drift into contemplation of something that extends far beyond ancient history. The way this extraordinary experiment in liberation continues to reshape human possibility thousands of years after its completion. Picture, if you will, the moment when the Hebrew people finally stood at the borders of the land that would become their permanent home. 40 years of wilderness education had transformed them from oppressed refugees into a mature civilization capable of self-governance. But now they faced perhaps their greatest challenge: translating the principles they had learned in nomadic simplicity into the complex realities of settled agricultural life. The land they were preparing to enter was not empty wilderness, but territory occupied by established civilizations with their own gods, their own laws, their own approaches to social organization. The Canaanite peoples who lived there had developed sophisticated urban cultures, military technologies, and economic systems that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience. From a purely practical perspective, the Hebrew people were about to attempt something that seemed almost impossible: establishing their own civilization in territory controlled by peoples who possessed significant advantages in population, military technology, geographical knowledge, and established infrastructure. Yet the wilderness experience had provided something that proved more valuable than any material advantage: a clear vision of what human society could become when organized around principles of justice rather than power, equality rather than exploitation, cooperative responsibility rather than hierarchical domination. Consider the psychological transformation this represented. Most ancient peoples understood their relationship to the divine in terms of appeasement, performing rituals and offering sacrifices to prevent divine anger or secure divine favor. The Hebrew understanding was fundamentally different. They understood themselves as partners with the divine in creating a society that reflected divine justice in human relationships. This partnership model had profound implications for every aspect of social organization. Rather than understanding law as the arbitrary will of human rulers, Hebrew law was understood as reflecting eternal principles that applied equally to everyone, including rulers themselves. Rather than understanding economic relationships as opportunities for exploitation, Hebrew economic law emphasized mutual responsibility and care for vulnerable populations. Most remarkably, rather than understanding political authority as the natural dominance of the strong over the weak, Hebrew political thought emphasized service, accountability, and the fundamental equality of all people before divine law. These principles might seem abstract, but their practical implementation created forms of social organization that were revolutionary in the ancient world and continue to influence human societies today. The Hebrew Bible preserves detailed accounts of how these principles were applied to specific challenges: urban planning, agricultural management, commercial regulation, judicial procedures, military organization, and international relations. The cities they built were designed around principles of accessibility and inclusion rather than defensive separation between social classes. Agricultural systems incorporated environmental protection and economic equity. Commercial regulations prevented exploitation while encouraging innovation and prosperity. Judicial systems emphasized fact-finding and consistent application of law rather than political convenience. Perhaps most remarkably, Hebrew society developed systematic approaches to caring for vulnerable populations: orphans, widows, foreigners, the elderly, the disabled, that were far more comprehensive than anything found in contemporary civilizations. These weren't simply religious requirements, but practical systems that ensured that social prosperity was shared rather than concentrated among elites. The military organization that developed during the settlement period reflected the same principles. Rather than creating professional armies that served ruling elites, Hebrew military service was understood as citizen responsibility for protecting the entire community. Military leadership was based on demonstrated ability and moral character, rather than hereditary privilege or political appointment. Even more significantly, Hebrew military ethics included restrictions on warfare that were unprecedented in the ancient world. Rules governing treatment of prisoners, protection of civilian populations, and environmental preservation during military campaigns reflected understanding that even necessary violence must be conducted according to moral principles. From the perspective of neighboring civilizations, these innovations must have seemed both fascinating and threatening. Here was a society that had achieved prosperity and security through methods that challenged fundamental assumptions about how human communities should be organized. Egyptian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilizations were built on clear hierarchies that concentrated power among small elites while treating everyone else as subjects whose primary function was to serve elite interests. The Hebrew model suggested that prosperity and security could be achieved through more egalitarian approaches that served everyone's interests rather than just those of ruling classes. This alternative model inevitably attracted attention from oppressed populations throughout the ancient Near East. Hebrew society became a destination for refugees, a source of inspiration for social reformers, and a demonstration of possibilities that challenged established authorities throughout the region. But the most profound impact of Hebrew civilization was not political or economic, but intellectual and spiritual. The Hebrew understanding of divine-human relationship introduced concepts that would eventually transform human consciousness itself. The idea that there might be universal moral principles that applied to all human beings, regardless of their social position, ethnic background, or political circumstances, was revolutionary in the ancient world. Most societies understood morality as socially constructed. What was right for rulers might be wrong for subjects. What was appropriate for one's own people might be inappropriate when dealing with foreigners. Hebrew thought, by contrast, developed the concept of universal moral law that applied equally to everyone. This concept provided the intellectual foundation for later developments in human rights, international law, social justice, and individual dignity that continue to shape human societies today. Similarly, the Hebrew understanding of history as purposeful rather than cyclical introduced concepts of progress, development, and social improvement that were largely unknown in ancient thought. Most ancient peoples understood history as repetitive cycles of rise and decline, with no expectation that human societies could actually improve over time. The Hebrew experience of liberation, law-giving, and social development suggested that history might have direction, that human societies could learn from experience and create better conditions for human flourishing, that individual and collective effort could actually reshape social reality in beneficial ways. These intellectual innovations provided conceptual foundations for developments that wouldn't fully emerge until centuries later. Scientific investigation that seeks to understand natural law, democratic governance that applies universal principles to all citizens, economic systems that balance individual initiative with collective welfare, and international relations that recognize common humanity across cultural differences. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Hebrew experiment was its demonstration that ordinary people, when properly prepared and appropriately organized, are capable of creating extraordinary civilizations. This wasn't achieved through superhuman leaders or miraculous interventions, but through careful attention to education, institutional development, and moral formation that enabled regular human beings to accomplish remarkable things. The story of Moses and the Exodus, understood from this perspective, becomes not just ancient history, but a case study in successful social transformation that continues to offer insights for contemporary challenges. The same principles that enabled Hebrew society to achieve justice, prosperity, and security remain relevant for societies that seek similar goals today. Consider the parallels between Hebrew approaches to economic inequality and contemporary discussions of wealth distribution, social safety nets, and sustainable development. Hebrew law included systematic provisions for preventing excessive accumulation of wealth, ensuring that everyone had access to basic necessities, and protecting environmental resources for future generations. Similarly, Hebrew approaches to governance emphasize accountability, transparency, and service that anticipate modern concepts of democratic responsibility. Hebrew leaders were understood as servants of the community rather than masters of subjects, accountable to both law and divine authority rather than arbitrary in their exercise of power. Even Hebrew approaches to international relations included concepts of proportionality, civilian protection, and post-conflict reconstruction that anticipate modern developments in international humanitarian law and peace building. The educational system that developed during the wilderness period, emphasizing practical skills, moral development, and civic responsibility, offers insights for contemporary discussions about educational goals and methods. Hebrew education was designed to prepare people for citizenship rather than just economic productivity, for moral leadership rather than just technical competence. Most profoundly, the Hebrew understanding of human dignity as reflecting divine image provides conceptual foundations for contemporary human rights discourse that extends far beyond any particular religious tradition. The idea that every human being possesses inherent worth that must be respected regardless of social position, economic status, or political circumstances has become central to modern concepts of justice and equality. As we approach the end of our gentle exploration of this remarkable story, it's worth reflecting on what made this ancient experiment in liberation so durably influential. The Hebrew people didn't simply escape oppression. They created alternative forms of social organization that proved more effective at promoting human flourishing than the systems they replaced. They didn't just achieve political independence. They developed concepts of law, governance, and social responsibility that continue to influence human societies thousands of years later. They didn't just preserve their own cultural identity. They contributed insights to human understanding that have benefited countless other peoples and civilizations. The figure of Moses, viewed from this perspective, represents not just religious leadership, but a model of transformational leadership that remains relevant for contemporary challenges. His combination of strategic thinking, moral vision, and practical competence enabled him to guide his people through changes that seemed impossible to their contemporaries, but created lasting benefits that extended far beyond their immediate situation. His willingness to sacrifice personal advantage for community welfare, to accept responsibility for outcomes he couldn't completely control, and to invest decades of effort in preparing others for challenges he wouldn't live to see, reflects understanding of leadership as service rather than domination that continues to inspire people working for social change today. But perhaps the most important legacy of this entire story is its demonstration that transformation is possible, that human societies are not fixed by natural law or divine decree, but can be reshaped through careful planning, sustained effort, and commitment to principles larger than immediate self-interest. The Hebrew people began as oppressed slaves and became free citizens. They started with no political institutions and created governmental systems that influenced civilizations for millennia. They began with no legal traditions and developed legal principles that continue to shape human justice. They started as a frightened multitude and became a mature civilization capable of contributing to human progress. This transformation didn't happen quickly or easily. It required 40 years of careful preparation, systematic education, and gradual development of skills and institutions that enabled them to succeed under challenging circumstances. But it did happen, and its success demonstrates possibilities that remain available to human societies willing to invest similar effort in similar principles. As you drift towards sleep, let this gentle truth settle into your consciousness. The story of Moses and the Exodus continues today, not as ancient history, but as ongoing demonstration of human possibility. Every generation faces its own forms of oppression, its own challenges of liberation, its own opportunities to create social conditions that better serve human flourishing. The principles that guided Hebrew transformation, commitment to justice over power, equality over hierarchy, cooperative responsibility over individual domination, remain as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. The methods they developed, careful planning, systematic education, institutional innovation, moral formation, continue to offer guidance for people working to create positive social change. Most importantly, their demonstration that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when properly prepared and appropriately organized continues to inspire hope that current challenges, however daunting they might seem, can be addressed through sustained human effort guided by principles larger than immediate convenience. Sleep now, and dream of possibilities that await discovery, of transformations that await implementation, of legacies that await creation by people who understand freedom not as escape from responsibility, but as opportunity to serve something greater than themselves.